you actually structure the hiring process for a product team? And Jack, picture me as like a younger founder. Like, how do you advise me on how to hire and structure that process?
You'll hear me say this a lot. You could ask me about just about any question about how to apply process to it, and I'll go back to the same kind of design thinking process. Because the beauty of design thinking is that it's a way of solving problems. It's a process for problem solving. And by the way, not having a team member that you need, that's a problem for the organization and one that you have to figure out how to solve. And so I really look at every process as this iterative process that, it starts with defining the problem. And hiring is the same, right? If you're a startup founder or a public company CEO or whatever it might be, before you start the process of actually looking for a candidate, you have to understand and define the problems within your organization that need solving through hiring somebody new. And I think what you find when you do that exercise is that oftentimes you can solve those problems by changing something existing within the organization, changing a process, moving somebody between roles, changing their scope or the responsibilities, doing a reorg. All of these things are different tools you have at your disposal to solve a problem without necessarily needing to bring in someone. Now, oftentimes the problem you're facing is you've got a gap in skill sets. You need an additional person, right? Whatever it might be. And once you've identified that problem and the scope and responsibility that is required from that person, then you can start the hiring process. But I think that's, the thing I think I can add most to anybody who's thinking about hiring is, there are plenty of books you can read about how to interview, what questions to ask, what to look for, things like that. But I think what people often forget is that step 0 or that step -1, where you're actually really defining what you need in the first place.
How do you do that effectively? Like, I'm constantly hiring and I'm like, well, people like, do you have a job description? I'm like, not really. I just know I need this person, and they're going to do newsletters and YouTube and copyright for the blog. Not really done the JD. Would you advise me?
And to be clear, I think based on the stage of the company and the need for that role, like, you don't always need a JD. It doesn't always need to be exactly prescriptive. And I'd imagine, Harry, that you have a really good sense for what you need, what you're looking for, and what that person is going to be responsible for when they join. And you've come to that sense by taking in a bunch of, different information from the things that you're working on, the people you're working with, the opportunities you have in front of you, the vision of where you want to go. All of those things come together to help clarify for you what it is you're looking for. That's basically this process, right? You have to start by talking to the people. You got to understand, like, what needs do your team members have? Where do they feel stretched thin? What skill set gaps do they see? Just like when you're building a product, you start by talking with the customers. In this world, when you're hiring somebody, your customer is your team. You're trying to make their jobs easier. You're trying to make them more efficient. You're trying to make them, enjoy the work they are doing more, not have to do some of the work that, they're less equipped to do or less passionate about. And so it really starts with having those conversations, talking with the people you work with, understanding their needs, understanding where they see the gaps. And you got to take in all that information, you need to parse it, and you need to come out of it with some instincts around, what it is you need to hire.
Can I ask you, in terms of like the process for hiring new team members at Snapso for product, like, is it like a meeting with a PM and then a meeting with someone else and then a meeting with you? Like, what does that actual process look like?
It depends on the role. It depends on the level. It depends which team they're sitting in. But for the most part, I think like many companies, we have a screening call first. It's usually just 30 minutes. It's kind of a get to know you. You provide some information about the role. You ask a few questions. Make sure that there's at least a pretty strong likelihood of a fit. And you do that so that you're not wasting the time of 6 or 7 people in an interview loop spending 45 minutes each with this person, which is time consuming, especially when you're in hypergrowth. Like, people will spend a lot of time interviewing. And so those screens are a really important way to make sure that, that is time well spent. I think once you get into the interview stage, I think one thing that is really important when we're doing our hiring is making sure that the panel of the folks interviewing this person are diverse and, not just from a ethnicity standpoint or socioeconomic standpoint, but also from a roles and discipline standpoint. If you're a product manager at Snap, you're going to be working very closely with engineers. You're going to be working very closely with designers. You're going to have to be able to, juggle all of these different roles and disciplines and work well with them. And so we want to make sure that our panel is well-rounded from that front and can really, gauge how well this person can work across those different disciplines.
What are the biggest hiring mistakes you've made? The biggest for me has always been I've over-indexed on logos. I think young founders in particular do this. They kind of question their own judgments. They go, oh, wow, you were at Pinterest and X before, and it gives us confidence. What are your biggest mistakes?
I would say that the biggest mistake in hiring is actually not a mistake that leads you to hiring the wrong person. It's how you deal with the moments when you do hire the wrong person. Because, interviewing is hard. It is not a perfect science, and we make mistakes. We all do. And, I think sometimes the candidates make a mistake too. They think they want this job. Once they're there and they're working on it, they realize it's not a good fit for them for some reason, right? These things happen. So there's this kind of risk on both sides of the equation. And so it's never going to be perfect. So the biggest mistake you can make is when you bring somebody on who's not a good fit, not dealing with that quickly. Because have somebody who's not performing or not getting up to speed quickly enough becomes an anchor for the entire team. And, I think one of the most impactful ways to make a team more efficient is to make sure that those low performers are moving on. And that is a cycle that happens pretty quickly. When you hire somebody, pretty quickly whether or not they're going to have what it takes in that role. And so I think the biggest hiring mistake that many people make, and that I myself have made in the past, is not actually being decisive enough in those moments when you realize it's not a good fit.
I once heard that if you're doing hiring right, you get it right 50% of the time. What would you say your right ratio is?
That's a really good question. I think that's about right, by the way. I think that you're going to get it wrong about 50% of the time. Now, that doesn't mean 50% of the people you hire aren't going to work out. But I will say about 50% of the people we hire end up changing their role or tweaking it or working on something slightly different because over time we realize that there's a better fit within that. I would say that for the most part, the people we hire will stick around for a while because, I think we have a good sense of what makes somebody successful at Snap. But of course, we're never perfect there. And I do think that 50% mark is probably at least a good one to strive for.